there's something you quietly stepped back from. Not because you stopped believing completely, but because nothing was responding anymore. You gave it time, effort, attention, and still, it felt like you were standing in the same place, waiting for something that never came. And eventually you reached that point where continuing felt heavier than letting go. So you started to detach, telling yourself it was better to move on than to keep investing in something that seemed silent. But listen carefully. Silence does not always mean something is over. Sometimes it means something is still forming in a way you cannot yet see. Because what you almost gave up on didn't stop existing, it simply stopped revealing itself to you for a time. And that pause, that gap between your effort and the response you expected, was not empty. It was a space where something was being adjusted, something being aligned beyond your awareness. You may have thought you reached the end, but what you were actually standing in was a moment of transition. And right now, something connected to that situation is beginning to shift again. Not loudly, not suddenly, but enough to remind you that it was never completely gone. While you were stepping back and slowly letting go, something important was still unfolding beneath the surface, even though you couldn't see any clear signs of progress. That's the part that made it so difficult, because you were measuring everything based on what was visible, based on what you could confirm with your own eyes. And when nothing changed on the outside, it felt like nothing was happening at all. But listen carefully. Not everything that is growing shows itself immediately. Some things develop in silence, in stillness, in a phase where there is no visible movement, yet everything is being prepared for the right moment to emerge. What you experienced as delay was not emptiness. It was a process that required time without interruption. During that time, you may have questioned everything. You may have wondered if you misunderstood the situation, if you expected too much, or if you held on to something that was never truly meant for you. And those thoughts didn't come from nowhere. They came from the absence of confirmation. Because when something matters to you and you don't see results, your mind begins to create its own explanations, often leaning toward doubt instead of trust. But what you didn't realize is that this period was not about proving something to you externally. It was about developing something internally. It was testing your patience, your perception, and your ability to remain steady even when nothing seemed to move. There are moments in life where progress is obvious, where effort leads to immediate results, where actions create visible outcomes. But then there are moments like this, where everything seems paused, where the connection feels distant, where the energy you once felt becomes quiet. And those moments are often misunderstood as endings, when in reality they are transformations. Because before something can return stronger, it often goes through a phase where it becomes unrecognizable, where it withdraws, where it reshapes itself without announcing what it is becoming. You may have interpreted that silence as rejection, or as a sign that you were holding on to something that no longer had life in it. And that interpretation felt logical, because nothing around you was giving you a reason to believe otherwise. But listen to this. Silence is not always a sign of absence. Sometimes it is a sign of preparation. Just because something is not responding the way it used to does not mean it has stopped existing. It may simply be moving through a phase where it is being adjusted, corrected, or realigned in ways that require distance and time. And during this process, something else was happening that you may not have noticed. You were changing. Your perspective was shifting. The way you viewed that situation, the way you approached it, the expectations you had, all of it was evolving. And that change within you was necessary, because what is about to return cannot return in the same form it had before. It has to meet you where you are now, not where you were when it first began. And that means both the situation and your understanding of it had to go through a period of separation. This is why the timing felt so uncertain, because you were no longer connected to the old version of it. But you hadn't yet seen the new version take shape. You were standing in between, in a space where nothing seemed defined, where everything felt unclear. And that space is often the most uncomfortable, because it doesn't give you answers, it only gives you distance. But that distance was necessary. It allowed things to settle, to shift, to become something different without interference. Now, as this phase begins to end, what was once silent is starting to move again. Not in the same way, not with the same energy, but in a way that reflects everything that has changed during that time. And this is where you begin to understand that what you thought was gone was never completely gone. It was simply going through a stage that required patience, even when patience felt like the hardest thing to maintain. You reached a point where continuing no longer made sense, and that didn't happen suddenly. It built up over time. The waiting became longer, the silence became heavier, and the lack of response slowly started to drain your belief. At first, you told yourself to be patient, to give it more time, to trust that something would eventually shift. But as that shift never came, your confidence began to weaken. You started questioning not just the situation, but your own judgment. Was it ever real? Did you misunderstand something? Were you holding on to an idea that only existed in your expectations? And the more you thought about it, the more it felt like the only logical thing to do was to step away. Because staying began to feel like wasting your energy on something that wasn't giving anything back. And that moment, that exact moment where you felt like giving up, wasn't random. It was a breaking point, but not in the way you think. It wasn't there to push you away permanently. It was there to bring you face to face with the truth of how much you were carrying without receiving clarity. Because sometimes the reason something reaches that level of pressure is not to end it, but to transform how you relate to it. Up until that point, you were holding on from a place of expectation, hoping for a specific outcome, waiting for things to return in a way that matched what you originally believed they would be. But that version, that expectation, could not continue forward the same way. What you were experiencing was not just frustration, it was a shift in your connection to it. The energy changed. The way you saw it changed. And that change created discomfort, because it forced you out of the familiar pattern you had been in. You were no longer able to engage with it in the same way, and that made it feel like everything was falling apart. But listen carefully. When something is about to shift into a new phase, the old version of it often becomes unsustainable. It stops working the way it used to. It stops giving the same signals. It creates distance, not to end itself completely, but to break the pattern that can no longer continue. And this is why that moment felt so intense. Because it wasn't just about losing something. It was about losing control over how it was unfolding. You could no longer predict it, manage it, or influence it in the way you were used to. And when that control disappears, it creates uncertainty. It makes you feel like the situation is slipping away from you, like it's no longer within your reach. And in that state, your instinct is to protect yourself by stepping back, by detaching, by preparing to let go before it completely disappears. But here is what you need to understand. That breaking point was not the end of the story, it was the closest point to change. Because right before something begins to move again, it often reaches a phase where it feels completely still, completely unresponsive, almost as if it has stopped entirely. And that stillness creates the illusion that nothing is left, when in reality everything is being repositioned. The structure that existed before is being adjusted, the dynamic is being reset, and the way it will return is being shaped differently from what it was. You were not wrong for feeling like giving up. You were responding to what you could see and feel at the time. But what you couldn't see was that the situation had not ended. It had simply reached a point where it could no longer continue in its previous form. And that is why everything felt like it was breaking down, because in a way it was. Not to disappear, but to rebuild into something that could actually move forward instead of remaining stuck in the same cycle. And now, As you move past that breaking point, you're beginning to step into the part where things start to shift again. Not because you forced it, not because you figured it out, but because the process itself has reached the stage where it can begin to reveal movement again. And that is why this moment matters so much, because the point where you almost walked away was not a sign that it was over. It was a sign that something was about to change. Now this is where everything begins to feel different, even if you can't fully explain why at first. Because after all the silence, after all the waiting, after that moment where you nearly walked away completely, something starts to respond again. Not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in small, almost unnoticeable shifts that feel easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. And that's the key. This change doesn't announce itself the way you expected it to. It doesn't return as a sudden breakthrough or an instant result. Instead, it shows up quietly, as if testing whether you're still aware enough to recognize it. You might notice a slight movement where there was once nothing. A conversation that opens again, a new idea that reconnects you to what you had almost forgotten. A feeling that something is not as closed off as it once seemed. And at first, you may question it. You may wonder if it's real or if it's just temporary. Because after everything you experienced, after reaching that point of doubt, it's hard to immediately trust that something is shifting again. But listen carefully. These small signs are not random. They are the first indications that what you thought had gone completely silent is beginning to come back to life. And this is where many people miss what is happening, because they are expecting the return to look exactly like the beginning. They expect the same energy, the same form, the same pattern they were familiar with before. But what is coming back is not meant to be identical to what you had. It has changed. It has gone through a process just like you have. And that means the way it reappears in your life will feel different. More grounded, more defined, less uncertain than before. But if you're only looking for what it used to be, you might overlook what it is becoming. This stage requires a different kind of awareness, because the signs are subtle. They don't demand your attention, they invite it. And if you're still focused on how things ended, if you're still attached to the silence that came before, you might hesitate to engage with these new signals. You might hold back, unsure whether it's worth your attention again. And that hesitation is understandable. It comes from everything you experienced leading up to this point. But listen to this. The fact that something is responding again means the process has shifted. It means the phase of stillness is no longer where you are. And as these signs continue, they begin to build on each other. What starts as a small indication becomes a clearer movement. What once felt uncertain begins to feel more real. And slowly, you begin to see that what you almost gave up on was not ending. It was transforming. It needed time to reach this stage, time to move through everything that had to change before it. Could return in a way that actually moves forward instead of repeating the same cycle. You may also begin to notice something within yourself changing as this happens. The way you respond is not the same as before. You are more aware, more careful, more grounded in how you approach it. And that difference matters because it allows you to engage with this new phase in a way that supports growth instead of confusion. You are no longer approaching it with the same expectations, and that creates space for something more stable to develop. And this is the moment where realization starts to settle in, not all at once but gradually. You begin to understand that what felt lifeless was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for the right conditions to show signs again. And now that those conditions are forming, what was once silent is beginning to respond. Not to pull you back into the past, but to move you into a new version of something that was never finished. Now this is the moment where everything depends on what you choose to do next, because seeing the signs is one thing, but responding to them is something completely different. You've already gone through the silence, the doubt, the point where you almost walked away for good. And now that something is beginning to move again, you are standing in a position that requires awareness, not reaction. Because the biggest mistake you could make right now is rushing back into it the same way you approached it before. This is not about going backward, it's about moving forward differently. The signs you are seeing are not there to pull you back into the past. They are there to show you that something unfinished is ready to evolve into something new. And listen carefully. This is where many people lose the opportunity. They either ignore the signs because they've convinced themselves it's already over, or they rush in too quickly, trying to recreate what used to be instead of allowing it to become what it's meant to be now. But this moment is asking for balance. It's asking you to stay present, to observe, to allow things to unfold without forcing them into a shape that no longer fits. Because what is returning to life is not meant to repeat the same cycle, it's meant to move beyond it. And that requires you to meet it with a different mindset, a different level of understanding, and a different kind of patience. You may still feel hesitation, and that's natural. After everything you experienced, after reaching that point where you were ready to let go, it's not easy to immediately trust what is happening again. But listen to this. Hesitation is not a sign to withdraw. It's a sign to stay aware. It's there to remind you to move carefully, to recognize the difference between what feels familiar and what feels aligned. Because not everything that comes back into your life is meant to stay the same way it was before. Some things return so they can transform into something stronger, something clearer, something that actually supports your growth instead of keeping you in uncertainty. And this is where your role becomes important. Because you are no longer in the same position you were in before. You have more clarity now. You understand what didn't work. You felt what it's like to almost lose it completely. And that awareness gives you the ability to approach this differently. Instead of chasing it, you can allow it to come toward you. Instead of forcing outcomes, you can observe how it naturally unfolds. And in doing that, you create the space for something real to develop. Something that is not built on expectation, but on alignment. As these signs continue to grow stronger, you will begin to see more clearly whether this is something that is truly meant to move forward in your life. And that clarity will not come from overthinking or analyzing every detail. It will come from how it feels as it unfolds. Because what is meant for you does not create constant confusion. It creates a sense of direction, even if the full picture is not yet visible. And that sense of direction is what you need to trust, not the fear that comes from what happened before. So this moment right here is not just about recognizing that something is coming back to life. It's about deciding how you will engage with it. Will you repeat the same patterns, the same expectations, the same approach that led to the silence before? Or will you allow this to become something new, something that reflects the growth you've gone through? Because what you almost gave up on is not just returning. It is offering you a second chance to experience it in a way that is more aligned, more stable, and more real than it was before. And understand this clearly. You didn't go through all of that uncertainty just to end up in the same place again. You went through it so that when this moment arrived, you would be ready to handle it differently, ready to see it clearly, ready to recognize whether it truly belongs in your life moving forward. Because this is not just about something coming back. It's about whether you are ready to receive it in the right way.